this is based on Chinese language documents that we have mined and acquired. So it's all open source material. That there's a demand signal, and so the entity in China requests or highlights that they have a gap, either in technology or knowledge, that goes to a central database, and then it's actually farmed out across the world. And what's interesting about this is it really shows a nuanced understanding of where that technology is located and where to find that. And as you mentioned, the two things, the highest that showed up the most in our research was both AI, machine learning, and actually biotechnology. And one of the hub of activity for that in the United States was the Houston consulate.
Very interesting. The CCP has leveraged individuals outside of government to pursue technology transfer, targeting foreign researchers and business leaders in order to transfer that technology back to the PRC. Can you walk us through any examples that are particularly illustrative, either in academia or in the private sector, just to give folks a sense for like how this tactic really plays out in real life?
So what I'll speak to is a specific methodology that we see, and then, sorry, is that better? Okay, sorry about that. So what is interesting in both, as in my previous iteration working for, we always get questions about, okay, what is the list, right? What is the technologies that are being sought? And we do have that in a very general sense. But what makes that so challenging is what we call China's use of non-traditional collectors. And so these are actually the experts that are working on a particular area, working on a particular project, that are the ones that are targeting the technologies. What makes it so hard to counter a lot of times is initially some of these relationships begin as legitimate, whether they be collaborations or individuals that either join universities or join companies. But China has a number of policies, and one of the ones that I think pertains to this particular type of targeting of technology is one called serve in place. And it's something that we've seen reflected in Chinese policy documents since the early 90s. And it articulates that they seek to leverage individuals who have who are not living in China, who don't have any intention to go back, and they reach out to those people to fill strategic gaps, and increasingly even more so is the technological know-how. And so the how do you do things, how do you do quality control, how do you move technology out of the lab?
Wow. Mr. Pottinger, could you talk a little bit more about semiconductor manufacturing and fabrication, and how would you rate our efforts so far at trying to start the process of bringing that back to domestic production, and what additional efforts would you recommend?
Thanks, Senator. So the majority of the world's highest end chips are actually made in Taiwan by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. China has put well over $100 billion in subsidies into trying to replicate what Taiwan's able to do, and with very mixed results. In fact, they've not been able to replicate what Taiwan does, but what they are now trying to do, having recognized the fact they can't make chips at the bleeding cutting edge the way that Taiwan makes them, China's trying to make chips that are a couple of generations older than the chips that Taiwan makes. Now, older does not mean worse, because in fact, the device I'm talking to you on right now, or a personal smartphone, is made up of 10 chips, maybe only one of which is the really cutting edge chip. The others, which control graphics and voice and cameras and things of that nature, are older technology chips, which make up a massive segment of the market. They're still extremely important, and they can be leveraged in ways to make them greater than the sum of their parts, depending on how creatively you tie these things together. So what we do in the United States, we don't make that many chips anymore. We have a couple of exceptions. There's a company called Global Foundries in upstate New York that makes chips that are a couple of generations older. But it turns out that our military, most of our equipment runs on chips that are a couple of generations or more older because those systems stay in place for so long. So it's been critical that we have a certain amount of manufacturing here at home. We also, where we really lead is in the design of chips and also in equipment that's used in the fabrication of the chips. So those are areas where we want to do a better job, more strategic job of looking holistically at how we can deny China its very deliberate and clear objective of making itself completely independent and making us increasingly dependent on their supply for semiconductors, which until we have another technology are absolutely essential to every area where we want to compete in the innovative economy.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Polisky, let's talk about campuses for a minute. Nothing creates more friends for the United States of America than time in the United States of America. And this research discussion is one discussion. Another discussion is there are lots of Chinese students on campuses that have fine business schools, that have good health programs of various kinds, and other programs that don't do a lot of research. What are the dangers of us closing the door to smart, young Chinese people who want to come here and spend a couple of years, and how do we thread that needle?
Senator, that's a really important point. And it's really important to make that distinguish between undergraduates, graduate students that are studying things that we're concerned with. And I think it circles back to the remarks that I made about acknowledging how different our systems are. Because we can't possibly understand, I think my colleagues also spoke to this, the amount of pressure that some of those students can be under if their families are still in China. The most recent Global Human Rights Watch report that came out talks about surveillance happening on U.S. campuses of these Chinese students.
Well, I think we have to be careful there because just like we can't understand the pressure they're under, they can't understand what the United States is like in the same way as if they were here. And, Chinese students, particularly undergraduate students in a non-research setting on campus, I think that's a different thing than people, technical research, calling back the results to the mock lab in China somewhere. I think we need to be really careful about this because I think I'm going to go to Mr. Pottinger next. It seems to me that there is a likely change in a mindset here. We all know that China has a huge demographics problem, and I don't want to go down the demographics trail. The trail I want to go down is there are millions of young Chinese adults who in their whole life, they've had two parents who were totally focused on them and four grandparents who had one grandchild also totally focused on them in a country that had more things to share, more ways to buy things for that one grandchild. Are they going to have the same response to the increasingly repressive Chinese Communist Party that the generation before have had? Are we seeing some likely pushback from young Chinese adults who've had basically all the attention you could possibly ask for their entire life and almost everything they wanted to have from parents and grandparents?
Yeah, Senator, there's been recent reporting, some interesting reports have been written about sort of this ennui that is afflicting the younger generation of Chinese young men and women. I think that that the Communist Party has systematically removed from Chinese culture so many of the elements that could enrich people's lives, including faith, including what had been in the late 90s into the early 2000s a growing amount of free exchange and discourse, those things are now going in reverse. You're seeing the systematic stamping out of civic life, whether it's secular or religious. The most extreme example is the genocide taking place against traditionally ethnic Muslim minorities in Northwest China, but also against Christians and others. And access to outside information is getting more restrictive.
Let me see if I
less
can get,
so.
thank you. Let me see if I get one quick question. So Billy Maneva, what of this increasing, more restricted society, how is that, in all the ways you've looked at that, how is that coming generation going to react to that in a different way than their parents and grandparents have?
Senator, thanks for the question. I think your premise is correct. We are seeing that kind of slow change, but I would proffer that Xi Jinping is seeing that same change as well, and he's becoming more draconian. They've become the most impressive surveillance state in the history of the world, not only domestically in China, but as well as we heard here in the U.S. Those 320,000 students who come into the U.S. are forced to have Chinese phones with WeChat, so the Chinese can monitor them here. So when you are here, whether you're a student or a researcher, and you get a call from the Ministry of State Security asking you to do something for them, and your grandmother is sick or your father needs a job, you are going to do whatever they ask you to do. So as much as we see a change in the want of the Chinese young people to get internet, the quicker we see that, the quicker the Chinese Communist Party disallows them to have the internet.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Bennett.
Mr. Chairman, I want to first start by thanking you for not just holding this hearing, but for the focus of the Intelligence Committee's attention on this subject for quite a while. I've been on the committee now for 3 years, and what I'm about to say I didn't know before I had the benefit of the hearings that we have had, and that is that the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese government, will use any means, licit or illicit, to pursue their China First policy. And the question for us is whether we're willing or whether we're going to be collateral damage in all of that. And this isn't just a fight or a competition, let's use that language, a competition between two economies. It's a competition between democracy on the one hand and totalitarianism on the other. It doesn't have anything to do, as you said, with the decisions the Chinese people are making, but they are the decisions that the Chinese government has made, and increasingly in the last decade exported around the world. So we're facing the consequences of that all over the world. That creates a huge and heavy burden for us and for our democracy, I think, and calls into question some of the idiotic battles we've had around this place. Instead of being focused, our attention where it ought to be focused, calls into question whether or not we've done enough to work with our allies and other democracies around the world and other economies around the world who share similar equities to ours with respect to China, which the good news is almost every other economy and every other democracy in the world, not every one, but almost every one, shares those equities. And that's why, in the end, I'm optimistic. I think we can compete because I think we've got a much better system than they have when it's working properly and when it's working well. So I actually, in all of that, have a question. Maybe I'll start with Mr. Pottinger just because he's not here, and then anybody else who would want to answer it. If you disagree with anything I said, please feel free to do that. This is America. You can do that. We'd be happy to have it. But if you don't, I'd be curious what message you would like to send, to go back to the chairman's initial question, to private equity firms in the United States, to their leadership, the leadership of venture capital firms and other investment firms that are investing in Chinese technology, imagining that somehow it's not dual-use technology, imagining that somehow the Communist Party isn't going to be the beneficiary of this, and telling themselves that that ROI that Bill talked about somehow is worth whatever the risks are. So why don't we start, Mr. Pottinger, with you?
Thanks, Senator. I think that the argument on returns on investment is rapidly evaporating. I mean, we saw the obliteration of close to $1 trillion in shareholder value just in the last several weeks, as Chinese stocks were systematically rectified by regulators in Beijing. And so that argument, I think, over time is going to atrophy. But what I would tell private equity investors, including venture capital investors, is that ultimately many of the technologies that they're investing in fact, arguably almost every successful Chinese tech company that exists today was seeded with Silicon Valley or other foreign venture capital money, as well as with Silicon Valley know-how. And we know that some of those companies have now applied their technology to some of the most nefarious human rights atrocities since the mid-20th century. So that is going to come back to haunt companies in reputationally in ways that I think a lot of companies aren't yet prepared for.
Is there any, I've got 40 seconds left. I don't know if either of you would like to consume that.
I would just like to amplify Matt's message, and with the biggest, I would say the most painful salt in the wound is when American investors invest in tech companies in China where that technology was stolen from the U.S. in the first place. And then we are forced to buy that technology as consumers at the end of the day. So our fruits of our thoughts and our ideations and our technology is stolen, and then we're forced to purchase it back from the Communist Party of China, is the painful salt in the wound.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cornyn.
Well, in typical Washington fashion, let me start out with some acronyms. CFIUS, FIRMA, ECRA, and FARA. I want to ask two questions about those topics. One is, in 2018, we did export control reforms. We reformed the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and gave Treasury Department, which convenes that, the CFIUS, a lot more resources, and I'd like to get your analysis of what's changed and what needs to change, what hasn't changed. And then on FARA, we've done a lot of work. I know, particularly in the Judiciary Committee, Senator Feinstein and Senator Grassley and me trying to get reforms of the Foreign Agent Registration Act. The lobbying disclosure statement is a Lobbyist Disclosure Act, I think it's called, provides an out for foreign agents to register as lobbyists, but not as foreign agents, and basically impeding the benefit of our knowing who's a foreign agent and who's not. I think this is one of the biggest untold problems that we have dealing with foreign countries, including China, is we know other countries hire lobbyists and other agents, but if we don't know who they are and what their agenda is, it's pretty hard for us to put that in the proper context or protect ourselves. You know, we're supposed to represent our constituents and Americans, not the interests of foreign countries. But if we don't know what the who's who, it's a real problem. So I might ask the three of you if you have something you could tell us about the CFIUS and FIRMA and export controls, and if you feel like we are where we need to be, if there's more we need to do. And then I think I heard Mr. Pottinger talk about FARA as I was walking in, but I would invite any one of the three of you to talk about that issue as well. So maybe, Mr. Evanina, can we start with you?
Thank you, Senator. And great question. And all three, CFIUS, FARA, and FIRMA, are very important aspects of how the government deals with this epidemic. I do think that subsequent to the legislation in a few years ago, I think we still need to appropriate more resources to it. I think, yes, it was housed in Treasury, but there are a multitude of other agencies who could add value to that, who did not increase resources to that effort. So I do think it's the right vehicle. There's just not enough people in that vehicle to do that work. So I'll caution with that. Secondarily, I think the premise of some of these is a little skewed because, as Anna talked about, the non-traditional collectors who come here either wittingly or unwittingly working for the Communist Party of China don't know they're lobbyists and don't know they're here registering as a foreign agent. Most likely they're not. And oftentimes they can conduct high-level research at a ceramics lab or an institute, and then get a phone call one day by someone back home. They don't know that they're an agent of a foreign power, and they don't know that they're a lobbyist. So I think sometimes the nomenclature and lexicon needs to be shaped and formatted more towards the non-traditional collector.
Ms. Puglisi, would you care to comment?
Sure. So it's encouraging, and all of the hard work that everyone on the committee has done, especially in these different areas. I think going forward, going back to my remarks, I think it's important to remember the multifaceted ways that China targets our technology and how different the systems are. I think one of the challenges, as we break this problem down into specific slices, we as a country, because we are a law-based society, because we are a rules-based society, try to get things narrow to a specific point. But when we're dealing with a non-rules-based adversary or entity, it makes those policies much more difficult to not only enforce, but to have the desired outcome. And so I think as we move forward, we need to think about what is the desired outcome of the efforts across the board with technology acquisition, and how do we mitigate some of these activities, and design policies and programs in addition to the ones that we already have that get at how do you deal with a non-rules-based entity.
Mr. Pottinger, would you care to comment?
Senator, thanks for your leadership on FIRMA a few years back, which was a real improvement on CFIUS. I would say that where there's still a loophole is in the area of venture capital and private equity. Beijing benefits enormously just from having a seat on those funds. It gives it a sort of a panopticon to see all of the newly emergent companies and technologies that they want to then target for more in-depth scrutiny and investment and theft. I think it's on the FARA front, making a searchable public database that's frequently updated so that it becomes much more public and much more comprehensive, that all of that activity that you were referring to, some of which is not currently captured, but which needs to be. Thank you.
Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for having this hearing and focusing our attention on these issues in this open setting. I wanted to start by making reference to Mr. Ivanini's background. He's a Lackawanna County, Pennsylvania native, a Valley View High School graduate, also a degree from Wilkes University. So I just hope after your career is over that you at least retire in Lackawanna County. But we're grateful for your public service and for the work you continue to do. I will probably direct my what I hope would be two questions to Ms. Puglisi and Mr. Pottinger, but Bill, feel free to weigh in as well. I wanted to start with an issue that Senator Cornyn and I worked on, especially in the lead up to the most recent competition legislation. We introduced a bill called the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act. It would establish an interagency committee to review outbound transactions, not inbound, but outbound, by U.S. firms to non-market economies like China that would, in my judgment and the judgment of a lot of people, result in the outsourcing of critical supply chains and create further U.S. dependence upon a non-market economy like China. I guess my first question is, to what extent is that kind of outbound investment by U.S. companies to non-market economies like China compromising our supply chain security and then subsequently our national security?
Thank you, Senator. I am not familiar with the legislation that you put forward, but I will comment on the supply chain question, the latter part. I think it's very important. And we see just most recently with PPE and how unreliable some of those supplies were. A colleague of mine has done a lot of research on medical supply chains, and especially as we discuss, okay, how do we have pandemic responsiveness when our supply chain, especially for APIs, especially for some basic drugs, are not located here. And so I think that gets back to the comment that I made in my prepared remarks about as we're examining those supply chains, we really need to look at, okay, what is the best value for the nation as opposed to the lowest cost? But that also gets at some of the market access issues as well, because we have seen cases, and I actually put in my written testimony about cases where because of that market access, we have pharmaceutical companies that are sending or closing down those API or kind of your more basic drugs manufacturing here and actually manufacturing those in China. So that with the draw of, okay, then they'll be able to sell some of their more lucrative materials there.
Thank you. Mr. Pottinger, any thoughts you have on
Thanks,
this?
Senator. Yeah, I think that I laud the goal that you're pursuing here, and with this legislation, which I haven't yet read, but look, the Department of Commerce has already declared 6 nations that are quote unquote adversaries of the United States. China's at the top of the list, together with others that you might imagine, Russia and Iran and a few others. One of the reasons that Beijing may have felt so confident and not, it really didn't bat an eye before destroying almost $1 trillion in shareholder value in its publicly listed firms in the United States, was because it's getting tens of billions of dollars through other means from more passive sources in the United States. These are institutional investors who are passively tying their money in the form of bond purchases and stock purchases to indexes. These index providers are weighing Chinese companies much more heavily than they used to, even as China becomes less and less transparent of an ecosystem to invest in. Almost every American reporter has now been kicked out of China. We have no idea what's going on with Chinese companies, yet these index providers keep putting more prominent weighting on Chinese companies so that more and more passive investment, ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars, is going into Chinese stocks and bonds. That's a big problem. So I think if we had sort of an outbound CFIUS mechanism, that's definitely worth exploring. The others look at Hong Kong as well. Hong Kong has now, unfortunately, been turned into a typical Chinese city, and we should be treating them the way that we treat mainland China when it comes to inbound and outbound investment.
Thanks very much. Mr. Chairman, I'll submit a question for the record on intellectual property, but we'll do that for the record.
I think you're pursuing an interesting line of questioning, and I think what Mr. Pottinger just said there, it wasn't just the folks that went directly in to some of these companies who've lost all this value, but oftentimes the passive investors. And the thing is, these companies are not going to disappear. They may simply be replaced with more Chinese investors and a more compliant leadership in those firms. Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Evanina, you were the head of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. In 2018, DOJ required state-sponsored media outlets like Xinhua News and China Global Television Network to register as foreign agents. Yet, when Americans visit those websites, when Americans read or listen to watch those stories, there isn't even the most basic labeling information for the consumer that are visiting a foreign agent-registered news site. This is true for Russia, too. Russian media outlets like Sputnik that run influence operations through radio shows in the U.S. are forced to register as foreign agents by DOJ, but no one notifies the Americans who are listening to the shows or who are reading their stories. And I think that's really irresponsible. Why is the burden on the U.S. consumer to go to the DOJ website to hunt down FARA filing forms to know where they're getting their information?
Senator, thanks for the question. And I think you were getting at the heart of what I believe to be the new frontier, which is malign foreign influence. And I think when we look at how countries like China and Russia facilitate their influence here, it starts with media and manipulates social media, TV stations, newspaper, print, and we are unable to see it. And I will proffer that the U.S. government's inability to look at media due to constitutional issues provides a vast gaping hole for who should do that, right? I think it's unfair, as you said, for constituents to understand, and they're not going to go to DOJ website, but we don't have, I would reference, State Department has a global engagement center. We don't have a domestic engagement center to help advise and inform Americans as to how to identify where that influence is and what might be true or what might not be true from that website. So I do think we have a hole to fill with respect to understanding malign foreign influence to help Americans everyday living, technology, but also with elections in the future.
Where would you place that domestic engagement center? Under what agency?
Well, I would have to think more on that, Senator, but off the top of my head, I would say it would have to be partly in the intelligence community where it can garner the most real-time actionable intelligence from our collection. At the same time, it has to have a vehicle that could produce that intelligence unclassified to the consumers around America.
Right, because shouldn't this basic foreign agent information be affirmatively provided to American consumers so they can make informed decisions about where the foreign state-sponsored news is actually coming from?
Yes, and to that point, I think if you look at things from an agency perspective of the goals, responsibilities, and the agency's names, I would say the Department of Homeland Security would be the right nomenclature for that kind of role.
So do you think that FARA needs to be strengthened or clarified in some of those loopholes that allow China and others to push their misinformation without any consumer protection notice?
Yes, I do think that any of these issues, whether it be FARA or FIRMA or CFIUS, should be looked at every year because the technology moves and how we see our adversaries change their tactics based upon legislation we employ or policies. We have to update that on a year-by-year basis to understand how China or Russia or Iran has revectored their influence so we can act accordingly.
I think that also should apply in some respects to our platforms, our social media platforms, because especially in a current example like the debate about vaccinations, a lot of Chinese and Russians are actively trying to mislead Americans. And I think there has to be some responsibility to the purveyors of this information to have a way to know if they are foreign agents. Do you agree?
I completely agree, and I look back the last year or so, as Mr. Pottinger had referenced, and as I went through the election, the ability to siphon through malign foreign influence and messages that are factually not correct is a very difficult venue. And when we look at the abilities of our adversaries, Russia and China, to no longer seed information here, but to use our own information to amplify for other Americans, takes on its own new weight of a really difficult obstacle to be able to do that.
Ms. Puglisi, obviously foreign adversaries have tried to influence our country for a very long time. This is nothing new. Russia has attempted to steal our technology through investments, through exchange students, through cyber operations, attempted to recruit, tried to intimidate, stifle dissent, unflattering narratives, as does China. So obviously this is problematic and serious, but the question is, what aspects of this threat are new? And is it simply a question of scale and breadth of China's operations and theft of trade secrets that differentiate it? And how should these distinctions shape our strategy and counter their efforts?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I would say the aspects that are new is that it's more and more in the civilian space. And I think if you raise the issue of the Soviet Union, when we look back on that, it was very heavily military focused. And some of my earlier comments about how our traditional structure of CI is focused on intelligence officers, on things that were completely illegal, things that have a direct military application. And the way China targets our technologies and the way it leverages its own diaspora, I think is something that's very new. It's also the scale and scope and the fact that these are central government programs that have been in place for decades, that focus on the influence piece, the civil technology piece, and really target the gray areas of our civil society. And you pair that with the largest crackdown on civil society that we're seeing in China under Xi, And it's a really toxic mix.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. I just have one more question, and I know a series of 6 votes has started, and that's why some of my colleagues have, I think, gone back to the floor. One, I want to thank all 3 of you. But my sense, and I liked one of Matt's ideas a lot about all these of the 300, it used to be 360,000, I think we're down to 320,000 Chinese students. Give every one of those students an American phone when they got here, so they are not surveilled constantly. But my sense of the Chinese economy, and one of the challenges we have, frankly, for any American, or for that matter, Western-based company, and I would point out that while this committee, I think, got ahead of the game a little bit on spotting 5G, it really came, the first signs of warning about Huawei didn't actually come as much from the intelligence community, came from places like Japan and South Korea and elsewhere. But it seems to me that the Chinese economy has allowed, and I don't know if that's changing dramatically now as we see the leadership and some of the value taken out of some of the most successful tech companies in these last few months. But for last 5 to 10 years, China would allow a ferocious level of competition, at least within the tech space. But that competition would be allowed until a national champion emerges, well, a la Huawei or ZTE. And once that, and in that space, no Western, no American, for that matter, any Western company could actually be on the competitive edge. There would never be allowed a Western or American company to kind of win in one of these new technology areas. Matter of fact, as we know, with Facebook being excluded, or Google trying for a while and then leaving on their own accord, and others. And the idea that Chinese technology winner then suddenly, even if they're independent, gets the full backing of the state, well, we've talked about $100 billion plus, is really an economic model, kind of an authoritarian capitalism model, that I don't like, but it's had a pretty successful record recently. Because if you then combine that not only with the financial support, but also with the Belt and Road Initiative, the Digital Silk Road, China's increasing power around the world, you suddenly had a series of, well, maybe not satellite countries in the traditional mindset, at least countries that were dependent on China's forbearance because China happened to be also building a bridge or building a road in many of those countries. I think that model is hard to compete against. I think we've seen it as well, and I think this committee spent a lot of time looking around this issue, which I raised in my opening comments, around standards and rules of the game, again, within technology. Because I would argue that, again, I use the Sputnik example, but post-Sputnik, virtually every major technology innovation over the last 60 years, if it wasn't invented in America, we still got to set the rules and the standards and the protocols. And those rules, whether it was about transparency or respect for human rights, even in technology standards, you can embed some of your standards. It kind of crept up on us in 5G, and I say this as an old telecom guy, where suddenly China was flooding the zone on these international standard-setting bodies with engineers, with power, and they are, I would argue in many ways, on the 5G issue, they won the standard-setting component. And unfortunately, we're seeing, whether it's in AI or facial recognition or a host of areas where they have now had the audacity to lay out with a great deal of specificity where they hope to dominate, they are being fairly successful. So the question I have for all 3 of you, and my last question is, I don't believe we can do this alone. I think some of our greatest strengths has been our alliances, that there is a moment in time where not just Five Eyes or not just NATO, but our democracies around the world. I would even argue that we may be entering in an era where post-World War II was an era of military alliances, NATO, CETO, a series of others. 60s and 70s of last century started European Union being a classic example of economic alliances. I think in 2021 and going forward, we need to think about technology-based alliances. And those alliances ought to be based upon democracies who share those same sets of values and goals of democracy. And that needs to start in areas like standard setting. It is where we have actually finally put our money where our mouth is in terms of recent legislation that virtually everybody on this committee supported around support for semiconductors. And we did get a smaller slug in for 5G and O-RAN. But I'd ask all three of you, and I'll start, Anna, with you, then go to Bill, and then let Matt close out. How should we think about this effort to get our allies better engaged with us as partners, not into this bifurcation choice that you either got to be on our side or China's side, but do this in some level of collaboration around technology development, around standard setting, around, again, promoting a very alternative model to the authoritarian communism model, or authoritarian capitalism model that China has frankly practiced fairly well.
Thank you, Senator. You raised some really important points. I want to highlight the model that you described is one that China has laid out for its strategic emerging industries. It's winning the China market first, creating that national champion, and then having that go out and compete on the world stage. And talking about Huawei, I think, is a great example of that. What it highlights are those areas and what are those characteristics of these different industries where profit margins, national security, in some ways, go in opposite directions. And how do we actually compete with that? Because those industrial policies of our like-mindeds are very, very different in scale, scope, and flavor than what we're seeing with China. Forming those tech alliances will be, in my opinion, are very, very important. And it's looking out across how do we can't out China, let's face it. But we don't want to. We want to double down on the advantages of our own system. And that is working with our partners and allies in building those innovation hubs, finding those niche areas. Some countries will be set for tech alliances in certain areas, some in different technologies. But it's also, I think, it's part of that information sharing and risk calculation sharing that we should have those dialogues about what's at stake and how we can use technology that are in line with our values and the values of our allies and partners.
Thank you. Bill?
Senator, first, thanks for having this hearing. I think it's really important for the American public to understand the issues that you and the Vice Chair brought to the openness since we hadn't closed hearings for a few years. I think your premise is right on our need to cooperate and collaborate with our allies. However, I will proffer that we need to lead in that collaboration. I think with respect to my colleague Anna's point, China's not going to change. And I think if there's one thing in DC that we have bipartisan support on is that China is going to be China and they're going to double down. We have to make a decision in America. Do we want to change the way we operate? We clearly are bifurcated for the right reasons between the government and the private sector. I will proffer it's time to change the way we look at that and really look at how we are willing to change the construct for partnering with private sector industry technology to be able to build coalitions between our government first in industry and then show that leadership to our allies in Europe and other places so they could use that as a framework. We won that argument with Huawei for the same reason. I think the next step with technology is to do the same methodology, find champions in the U.S. and have the government partner with so that we look at China as a competitor, not just as an enemy, and we can compete, because we can't compete because we're America, and we will win if we may put our mind to it. Secondarily, as we did with Huawei, other countries and allies will watch and learn and do the same methodology in their own country to do the same diplomatic and technological solution. So I do think we have an opportunity here with allies if we change the way we do business here in the U.S.
Very good. Matt, and recognizing I've got to go run vote in a moment.
You bet. Thanks, Senator. Very quickly, I agree with you. I think your vision for these sort of coalitions around certain technologies, coalitions of the willing, if you like, is the way that we need to go. And there's precedent for that. During the Cold War, we had what was called the Coordinating Committee, where industry in Japan and the United States and other allied countries made sure that the Soviet Union didn't gain access to our most cutting-edge semiconductor technology. Here we are again, and it's the same technology, it's semiconductors. We've got to win that race. Commerce needs to be brought firmly into the fold. The Bureau of Industry and Security has to be really treated and think like a national security arm of the U.S. government, not a trade promotion arm, if we're going to win on semiconductors. We've got to make peace with the Europeans on these privacy issues and these things that we're tied up with. Right now, the Europeans are very inconsistent in how they're viewing privacy. They're targeting American technology giants, but they're not applying the same standards to Chinese companies, which are going to be truly harmful to the interests of Europeans and disrespectful of people's privacy of their data and so forth. So that's an area where we need to break through. But I think I agree with you with those kinds of coalitions, even if it's not one neat global approach, but one of different coalitions. I think we're unbeatable.
Well, thank you all. And just two quick last comments. One, to not just American industry, but all of the Western industry that is invested in China. We can no problem with that, as long as it's not at the price of your values, as long as you do not surrender to, as Senator Rubio pointed out, that you turn a blind eye to human rights abuses, or you are willing to be co-opted into taking policies that you would not take, not only in the United States, but for that matter, any other country in the world. That we have to be constantly consistent on. And I think the business community needs to continue to hear these messages in these open settings and as appropriate in closed settings as well, so even further information can be shared. And then last point, and I again very much appreciate all three of the witnesses that in your opening statements you all hit on this point, and that is that this beef, our concern, our challenge is with the Communist Party of China and its leadership. And any forces in this country that instead play into broad-based racist or xenophobic statements about the Chinese people, the Chinese diaspora, Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, frankly, do a disservice to our country and our values, but also play right in to the CCP's agenda that you can never be, that the only place you will ever have a firm and permanent home is back in China. I think we, and I say this here for speaking on behalf of all the senators on this dais who are here today, need to redouble our efforts to make that distinction and to make sure that, particularly law enforcement, and I've spent a lot of time with Director Wray on this issue, that the FBI and others reach out on a very regular basis to the Chinese American diaspora in this country. They are under, as so many, Bill, as you've made comments, under a level of pressure sometimes that is extraordinary. And they are great Americans. They've contributed enormously to our country, but we need them in this challenge against the Communist Party's ideology. And and any observant person, doesn't need, I don't think, further proof, because you see the very nature of the treatment of the Uyghurs or the treatment of the people of Hong Kong. We need to keep that lesson and continue to make that point. I thank all of you for your contribution. There is much, much more to be discussed. We could have had a whole separate hearing just looking at the individual technologies that China's investing in and trying to outcompete us. We'll have that opportunity. But with that, hearing's adjourned. Thank you all.